Hi, tonight we slip into a room that smells like sun-baked clay and old reeds, where the air feels warm even when the lamps are low. You are standing at the edge of a Sumerian city, hearing soft sandals on packed earth. And somewhere inside a temple complex, a scribe is pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, line after line, like a metronome for the ancient world. The title on the knight's pillow is simple and a little dangerous to say out loud. Sumerian tablets reveal the gods left a departure protocol. Now, some parts of this are widely accepted history, because Sumer really did write on clay, and really did build temples that ran like institutions. Some parts are interpretation, because words can mean many things, and scholars debate what certain phrases are doing in a text. And some parts are calm. What if imagination, the kind that lets you watch the shadows move without insisting they are monsters? You probably won't survive this, meaning you probably won't stay awake, which is honestly the healthiest outcome. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because it is always a little comforting to know where in the world we are all drifting off together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into the city as if you belong there, because in dreams you always do. The ground is dusty, the walls are mud brick, and everything has that quiet, practical geometry of a place built to last, and rebuilt 100 times anyway. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, what we call Sumer, writing shows up early as a tool for record keeping, accounting, and administration. You can almost feel the reason for it in the air. There are jars of grain, bales of wool, baskets of dates, measures of oil, and all of it needs counting. Even in a sleepy story, the inventory never stops. You pass a small courtyard where someone is smoothing a fresh lump of clay on a board. It looks harmless, like something you would make in art class before you accidentally glue it to your sleeve and have to pretend it was intentional. Here, the clay is not a toy. It is a medium for memory, a portable little slice of decision. A reed stylus touches it, and the surface gives making wedge-shaped marks, the cuneiform strokes that turn breath into bureaucracy. Archaeology suggests that these tablets were often dried or baked, then stored, stacked, sorted, and archived. So the first anchor of solid ground is simple. There really are rooms, sometimes entire complexes, that function like ancient filing cabinets. The scribe you imagine tonight is not dramatic. He is tired, careful, and slightly annoyed that his dinner is cooling while he finishes this line. He sits cross-legged, a board across his knees, and he writes as if the world depends on it. In a way, it does. When you do not have paper, when you do not have a cloud server, and when your only backup is another lump of clay, every mark matters. You can hear the stylus click softly, like rain that never quite falls. This is where the phrase departure protocol starts to shimmer in the mind, not as a glowing sci-fi label, but as a human habit. People love procedures. People love checklists. People love knowing that if something leaves, something else remains in order. One interpretation is that when you see formulaic instructions, repeated phrases, or ritual sequences in a tablet, you are not necessarily reading about gods packing bags. You might be reading the ancient version of Step 1, do this, Step 2, do that, written so that the ritual can be performed correctly even when the original expert is gone. That is a practical idea, and it fits the world you are walking through. A world where a temple is not only a holy place, but also an economic engine. Still, the story has room for mist. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because some tablets do not read like pure bookkeeping. Some are hymns, myths, rituals, incantations, laments, and royal inscriptions. The language can sound ceremonial, even cosmic. And when ceremonial language mixes with administrative habits, it can feel like a protocol. It can feel like instructions left behind. You drift toward a larger building, the kind with high walls and a guarded entrance, a temple precinct. The smell changes. Less street dust, more smoke from offerings, more oil from lamps. You hear murmured speech that is half prayer, half business. Most historians agree that Sumerian temples were major institutions, tied to land, labor, and distribution. People worked temple fields, managed herds, brewed beer, wove textiles, and recorded deliveries. If you want a modern comparison, it is like a combination of a city hall, a warehouse, a bank, and a place where everyone also sings, which, honestly, would make tax day more bearable. Inside, you see shelves, not bookshelves, but shelves for tablets, baskets of tablets, piles of tablets, tablets with tags, tablets with seals. The clay looks like baked bread, except you should not eat it, even if you're curious, even if it looks crunchy. A small joke for your sleepy brain. The original snack was knowledge, but it had terrible dental consequences. You watch a clerk press a cylinder seal into a fresh tablet, rolling it like a tiny stamp. The seal leaves an image, perhaps a figure, perhaps an animal, perhaps a scene with divine symbols. Archaeology suggests these seals acted like signatures, identity markers, and security devices. That matters for the mood tonight. Because when a society cares about sealing, signing, and repeating official phrases, it makes sense that a departure protocol could exist as a pattern of language, not necessarily a literal set of instructions for gods to board a celestial boat, but a structured script for what happens when presence shifts. You sit near the scribe now, close enough to see the wedge marks forming. He's copying from an older tablet, maybe damaged, maybe worn smooth on the edges. You notice something calming, the repetition. Lines that begin the same way, like a lullaby. Lists of names, titles, epithets, places, offerings, days. It is the rhythm of a system. One interpretation is that these repeated openings and closings are the bones of tradition. They help the performer remember, and they help the institution maintain consistency. And then the misty part slips in, carefully, without trying to trip you. Because what if the repetition is not only memory, but instruction? What if the tablet is telling someone how to behave when the divine presence withdraws? Not in a thunderclap, not with drama, but with a bureaucratic calm that almost feels worse, like a manager leaving a resignation note on the break room table. You look at a line that, in your imagination, feels like a sign-off, a phrase that sounds like, "when the Lord has gone," or "when the goddess has departed," or "when the shrine is empty." Let me rephrase that more carefully. You are not seeing an exact translation tonight, because words shift across millennia and languages. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, it is plausible that some texts describe times of absence, abandonment, or the movement of divine favor. Because ancient Mesopotamian literature and ritual often deal with the presence of gods in temples, and the fear of that presence being lost, historians still argue whether divine absence in these texts should be read as a literal departure of a god, a metaphor for political collapse, a theological explanation for disaster, or a ritual drama meant to renew a community's bond with the sacred. You let that debate float above you like a paper lantern. No need to chase it. Just let it glow. You stand and wander deeper, where the air is cooler. Maybe you are in a storage room, maybe a schoolroom, maybe the quiet corner where apprentices practice their wedges. School tablets exist, practice pieces where students copy standard lists, proverbs, and exercises. What's broadly accepted is that scribal education was rigorous. You can almost hear the teacher's sigh, the ancient equivalent of, "No, you wrote that sign upside down again." Somewhere, a student is inventing the first known excuse. The clay did it. The mainstream history stays steady here. Sumerian writing develops through time, and the tablets that survive are diverse. Some are administrative, some are legal, some are literary, some preserve myths about gods, kings, and cosmic order. And the evidence we do have points to a culture that cares deeply about correct performance, correct offering, correct words. In such a culture, protocols are natural. So what makes this feel like a departure protocol to modern ears? Partly, it is the way rituals often include steps that resemble handover procedures. If a god's statue is moved, if a shrine is refurbished, if a festival requires a procession, there are rules: who carries what, which path, which day, which incantation, which offering, which purification. The language can look like instructions for a transfer of presence. One interpretation is that the gods leaving is a vivid way of talking about the movement of cult statues, the shifting of a city's patronage, or the theology of why things go wrong. A more cautious explanation could be that what sounds like departure is actually maintenance, like a ritual shut down and restart, ancient edition. But the mist wants its share too, and we promised it about 30% of the room. No more. So you allow yourself one gentle cinematic possibility. What if a scribe, working late, believes that the gods are not only ideas, but visitors? What if the temple is not only a building, but a dock? What if the repeated phrases are not only tradition, but a set of conditions, like, if this happens, then do that, ensuring that the relationship remains stable, even when the presence changes? You picture the city at night. Lamps flicker. Dogs bark once, and then remember they are tired. Somewhere on the ziggurat, the topmost terrace catches a cool wind. You look up and see stars, sharp and bright, because there are no street lights and no notifications popping up to remind you to drink water. The sky is a roof of points, and to a Sumerian observer, it can feel alive with meaning. Without claiming anything too certain, it's possible that some ritual texts connect timing, observation, and divine favor, because calendars and omens matter in Mesopotamian culture. That does not mean a spaceship schedule. It means a worldview where the heavens and the city mirror each other. Still, in the sleepy theatre of tonight, you can let the phrase departure protocol take on a symbolic glow. A protocol is what you do to keep order when something big changes. A departure is the ultimate change. So you watch the scribe press the last wedge of a line. He pauses. He checks his work. He smooths a mistake with a damp thumb and rewrites the sign. The clay accepts correction with a quiet patience that paper rarely grants. Then he writes a closing formula, perhaps a colophon, perhaps a simple identification, perhaps a note of who copied it and when. Again, we are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The tablet is set aside to dry. That act feels like sealing a thought. You can almost sense how the ancient world preserved itself, not by locking ideas in marble, but by baking them into clay. The solid ground is that these tablets exist and they carry voices across time. The misty ground is what you do with the voices, how you interpret tone, how you decide whether an instruction is practical, poetic, or both. You step back through the temple corridor and notice something small, a bundle of reeds tied with a fiber cord. It is nothing mystical. It is a tool. Yet, it becomes your quiet motif for the night. Reeds make styluses. Reeds become baskets. Reeds become mats. Reeds are humble, and they hold civilization together like a simple knot. If the gods leave in any sense, the reeds remain, the people remain, the work remains. And that is a kind of protocol too, the human one. On the way out, you pass a doorway where an older scribe is dozing upright, chin on his chest, stylus still in hand. You can relate. If anyone deserves divine assistance, it is the person who has to file the universe before breakfast. You smile and keep walking, letting the city's quiet sounds soften. The clay tablet dries in the dark, holding its lines, holding its structure, holding the possibility that a careful instruction was meant to outlast a presence. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And for now, you let the mist stay mild, like fog that makes the lamps prettier without hiding the road. You step into a bright, chalky morning that feels like it was poured over the city. The sun is already confident, already climbing, and the air carries a faint tang of damp clay drying on rooftops. A breeze runs along alleyways and lifts little spirals of dust, like the city is quietly practicing its own handwriting across the ground. You move toward the largest shape on the horizon, the ziggurat, stacked terraces rising like a staircase for the sky. Archaeology suggests these temple towers were real architectural statements, and even if scholars debate the exact rituals performed on every level, the evidence we do have points to temples being central hubs for worship, administration, and community identity. Up close, the ziggurat is less mysterious and more organized than people imagine. You notice work crews, baskets, guards, and a steady flow of people carrying jars, bundles, and sealed containers. It feels like an office that happens to touch the heavens. Most historians agree that temples in ancient Mesopotamia were major landholders and employers, running workshops and storehouses, redistributing goods, and keeping records. So you follow the rhythm of that daily machine and let your mind rest inside it. At the entrance, a priest is not floating or glowing. He is checking a list. His hair is neat, his hands are clean, and his eyes move from person to person with the polite boredom of someone who has done this for years. You almost want to ask him where the god's departure protocol is filed, but you keep it inside your head, because you enjoy not being escorted out. Inside the complex, you find the parts that make the idea of protocol feel natural. There are storage rooms with neat stacks of containers. There are workspaces where women twist fibers and men carve wood, where someone measures barley with practiced speed, where a clerk marks a tally without looking up. There is a courtyard where incense drifts in a thin ribbon, because even in a system obsessed with numbers, scent still matters. A careful reading might suggest that the boundary between sacred and practical is not a wall here. It is a hinge. The same hands that lift an offering also lift a ledger. Now your mind begins to understand how a departure protocol could exist in a temple world without needing any cosmic drama. When an institution runs on routine, it fears disruption. When the institution believes it is tied to divine favor, disruption becomes theological. One interpretation is that many rituals are designed as continuity devices. They teach the community how to keep going when leadership changes, when crops fail, when a city loses power, or when a patron deity seems distant. Even if the god is understood or present through a statue, a shrine, or a cult image, that presence has to be maintained. It has to be cared for, fed, clothed, sung to, honored, and kept in its proper place. That creates procedures. You wander into a room that feels like a treasury. Not coins, because this is not that kind of economy yet, but valuables all the same. Metal objects, fine textiles, seals. Maybe a ceremonial weapon displayed more as status than as threat, because a blade in a temple is often symbolic and tightly controlled. The objects are arranged with intention. And here you get a new development, something that makes the whole departure theme more concrete without leaping into fantasy. In many ancient religions, a god's presence is bound to a place through ritual attention. If the attention lapses, the relationship weakens. It's possible that what sounds like a god leaving is sometimes an explanation for why prosperity leaves. The temple becomes the switchboard of luck, and the rituals become the cables. When the cables are cut, the lights go out. That metaphor is modern, but the human feeling is old. You watch servants bring food and drink offerings into an inner chamber, moving quietly, respectfully, like they are entering someone's private office. This is mainstream enough to feel steady. Cult images in Mesopotamia were treated as living embodiments of deities, receiving daily care. Scholars continue to debate the exact theological nuance in every city and period, but the practice of caring for divine images is well attested across the broader region. So the protocol angle could simply be the correct way to handle that sacred presence. Now imagine a day when the image must be moved. Maybe for a festival procession. Maybe for repairs. Maybe for safety during unrest. Maybe because a new ruler wants to reshape the city's religious focus. In any of those cases, the movement of a divine statue would not be casual. It would be regulated, purified, announced, and sealed with formulas. One interpretation is that certain texts, especially ritual instructions, could read like a handover package for presence itself. You can see it in your mind, a checklist. Wash hands, purify the path, prepare offerings, Speak the right names. Open the doors. Close the doors. Record the event. Seal the record. Put the tablet away. So when modern viewers hear departure protocol, they might be hearing a dramatic echo of something that could have been more mundane, but still emotionally intense for the people living it. You step outside into another courtyard and notice a group of apprentices. Their heads are shaved or closely cropped, their tunics dusty, and their faces have that mix of pride and panic you see in anyone learning something difficult. They are practicing. You can tell because their tablets are small and the marks are uneven. Their teacher is pointing with a reed, tapping a line, correcting a sign. The teacher's expression says, "If you miss that wedge, you will summon a grammatical disaster," which might be the first academic horror story ever told. Most historians agree that scribal schools existed and that learning cuneiform required long practice. That matters because protocols depend on training. A protocol written on clay is useless unless someone can read it, repeat it, and teach it. So the temple is not only a warehouse and a shrine, it is a training center. It manufactures competence, and that leads you to a fresh, slightly unsettling thought, offered gently. What if some tablets are written specifically for times when the right people are missing? When the senior priest is gone? When the city's experts have fled? When a disaster has disrupted the normal chain of knowledge? A more cautious explanation could be that ritual texts are simply standardized for consistency. But it's possible that standardization also serves as insurance against chaos. That is a human thing, not a supernatural one, and it makes the phrase departure protocol feel strangely plausible as a description of intent. Historians still argue whether the most dramatic abandonment scenes in Mesopotamian literature are literal claims about gods leaving temples, metaphorical language for political defeat, or a ritualized way of processing trauma and restoring order. You let that sentence settle like a blanket. Debate exists. Uncertainty exists. And uncertainty is not a threat tonight. It is part of the atmosphere. Now the mist comes in with its share, but softly labeled. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts sometimes preserve hidden instructions meant for elites, like coded directives for what to do when the higher powers withdraw. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because humans love the idea of an insider manual. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about secrecy and authority, not about aliens, not about certainty, but about who gets to hold knowledge when everyone else is anxious. You look around the temple complex and notice how much is controlled by access. Doors, curtains, seals, inner rooms, titles, roles. The more important the space, the fewer people enter. Archaeology suggests that sealing practices and controlled storage were part of administrative life. And it is reasonable to imagine that ritual knowledge could be similarly gated, not proven, not guaranteed, just a plausible social pattern. You walk along a corridor where the plaster walls catch the light in a soft, sandy glow. A faint chant comes from somewhere deeper inside. It is not loud, not theatrical, just a steady line of sound, like someone humming a tune they have always known. You realize that repetition is not only for memory, it is for mood. Repetition calms the nervous system. If you were a community facing uncertainty, You would lean into repeated words the way you lean into a familiar song when you cannot sleep. So you step into a room where a ritual is being rehearsed, not necessarily because the god is leaving, but because the priesthood is maintaining readiness. A careful reading might suggest that the temple is always preparing for transition, because life is always changing. This is a new development for the listener. The idea of departure protocol might not be about one dramatic exit. It might be about continuous preparedness. The protocol is a way of keeping the relationship stable across countless little departures. A priest replaced, a king dying, a season shifting, a festival ending, a shipment delayed. A clerk in the corner is recording something. He writes while others speak. That is the heart of the temple as an institution. It does not only perform, it documents. Documentation is power. Documentation turns a fleeting act into a repeatable act. Documentation turns a ritual into a template. You notice a tablet with a list of offerings, measured precisely. Another with names, titles, perhaps duties. Another with a date. Another with a seal. Taken together. They look like an administrative bundle. In a modern office, it would be a folder labeled handover. Here. It might be a stack of tablets tied with a cord, and you can almost hear the whisper of a concept. Not confirmed, just suggestive. Maybe the departure protocol is a bundle of procedures that keeps the temple running when something sacred feels absent, when leadership shifts, when the social fabric needs a stitch. Now you allow one cinematic what if, just enough to make the night interesting. What if the inner chamber is quiet one day, and the priest notices the usual sense of presence is not there? Not a dramatic event, not a thunderbolt, just a subtle emptiness, like walking into a room where someone has just left and the air still remembers them. What if the priest opens a clay tablet and reads instructions for restoring balance? Not because the god literally boarded a ship, but because the community needs a script to follow when faith feels thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for inner feelings is always thin. But the human need for scripts during uncertainty is thick and obvious, and it shows up in every century. You move toward the outer courtyard again and see the ziggurat's shadow stretching across the ground. The shadow is long and steady, like a sundial that refuses to be impressed. The temple's size is a reminder that institutions outlast individuals. Most historians agree that city-states rose and fell, dynasties changed, and yet temple traditions often persisted, adapting, absorbing, rebranding, staying useful. If gods leave in literature, it might be a way of talking about real historical shifts, invasions, economic collapse, or political turnover, translated into sacred language. A fringe idea proposes that departure protocol language could reflect an actual expectation that divine beings might depart physically, leaving behind instructions for their caretakers. This is debated, and it is not widely accepted, but it can be treated as a mood, a cinematic lens. What if the protocol reads like a farewell because the writers wanted it to feel like a farewell? What if the temple is writing itself a bedtime story, an explanation that makes loss bearable? You take a slow breath and let the temple sounds fade into softness. A bird calls once from a wall. Someone laughs in the distance. A jar clinks. A reed broom sweeps dust in gentle arcs. Ordinary life continues, even in the shadow of enormous ideas. And as you leave the ziggurat precinct, you carry one practical conclusion that still feels mysterious. A protocol is the human way of making change less frightening. Whether the text describes gods, institutions, or the shifting luck of a city, the calm, structured language of instruction is a kind of comfort. It gives the mind steps to follow. It gives the hands something to do. It gives the heart a rhythm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. And the clue that glows brightest here is simple. In a world of clay, reeds, and towering temples, even the sacred can sound like administration. And even administration can sound like a whisper from something larger. You walk into a public square where the air tastes like warm bread and crushed herbs, and the city feels awake in a very official way. People cluster in little knots, murmuring, watching, adjusting their clothes as if the day itself is a judge. At the center, a raised platform has been swept clean. A few stools wait in the shade. A clay jar of water sits like a quiet promise that someone, somewhere, thought about comfort. Most historians agree that Sumerian city life is tightly tied to kingship, temples, and organized labor, even if the exact details shift across cities and centuries. The evidence we do have points to rulers presenting themselves as chosen, supported, or legitimized by divine powers, and to formal ceremonies that make authority feel solid. You can sense that solidity here, not as a magical aura, but as procedure. Everyone seems to know where they should stand. Everyone seems to know what comes next. A herald calls out a title, and the sound bounces off mud brick walls. People reply with a low chorus, not quite cheering, more like acknowledging that the system is still working. You move closer and notice the objects laid out on a small table. A cup, a small loaf, a bundle of reeds tied neatly, a seal, a tablet. It looks like a modest toolkit, but it carries the weight of a city's future. One interpretation is that kingship ceremonies in Mesopotamia are not just celebrations. They are contracts. They are rituals that stitch together humans, gods, and institutions into one functioning garment. You see attendants bring forward a tablet, and a scribe stands ready, stylus poised, like a cashier waiting for the final total. You can almost hear the ancient thought behind it. If it is not written, it might not be real. If it is not sealed, it might not be recognized. If it is not repeated, it might not hold. This is where the idea of departure protocol gets a new angle that feels surprisingly grounded. A departure does not have to mean a god literally walking out the door. It can mean divine support shifting. It can mean legitimacy, transferring from one ruler to another. It can mean the old order making room for the new. In that sense, a coronation can feel like a controlled exit as much as an entrance. You watch the ceremony begin with purification. Hands are washed. The cup is lifted. A short prayer is spoken in a steady cadence. There is no rush, no improvisation. This is a place where improvisation is how you accidentally offend the cosmos, and nobody wants that on their performance review. A careful reading might suggest that certain ritual sequences function like a checklist for maintaining continuity. Offerings to key deities, public oaths, confirmation of duties, redistribution of gifts, renewal of temple obligations. Even if the language does not say protocol in a modern sense, the structure feels procedural, and you can imagine a tablet that preserves the correct order. So the ceremony can be performed the same way every time, like a lock that needs the right combination. The scribe begins to write as the king speaks. The king is not screaming. He is making measured statements, and his voice has the careful calm of someone who knows people are listening for mistakes. He promises to protect canals, maintain justice, honor temples, provide for the city. Most historians agree that irrigation and canal maintenance are vital in southern Mesopotamia, and rulers often connect their legitimacy to caring for the land. That is a mainstream anchor, solid as packed earth. No canals, no crops, no crops, no city, no city, no king. The math is harsh, but at least it is simple. Now you notice something subtle that keeps the story fresh. The ceremony includes acknowledgements of absence. A name is spoken with reverence, perhaps a previous ruler, perhaps an ancestral figure, perhaps a divine patron whose favor must be renewed. In many societies, legitimacy is built by linking the present to what came before. But you do not need to mention time directions to feel that link. You just feel how the crowd quiets when a sacred name is said. The hush is a kind of door opening. One interpretation is that when texts talk about a god leaving a city, it may be reflecting a perceived loss of divine favor tied to political instability. If a dynasty collapses, if a city is defeated, if famine hits, the community might interpret it as the patron deity withdrawing protection. That withdrawal becomes narrative, ritual, and sometimes instruction. What if the tablet is not telling you the gods left because they felt dramatic, but because the city needed a story that explained why life suddenly felt unsteady? Historians still argue whether royal rituals were primarily theological acts meant to secure divine presence, political theatre meant to unify the population, or a blended system where religion and governance are inseparable. You let that debate drift through the square like dust in sunlight. You do not chase it. You simply watch how ceremony holds people together. You step closer to the table and see another tablet being unwrapped. This one looks older, darker, as if it has been handled many times. The scribe touches it with respect, not because it is mystical, but because it is authoritative. The reed stylus hovers. There is a pause that feels important. Here comes a fresh mystery angle, carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that some kings kept special tablets containing emergency rites to be used when omens turned sour or when a city faced crisis. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it fits a human instinct. Powerful people like having a private manual. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about control. The king wants to control not only the army and the grain, but also the narrative that explains danger. You watch the king place his hand near a seal. The seal is rolled onto clay, leaving an image that marks this act as official. Archaeology suggests seals function as signatures and security devices, and that is broadly accepted. The seal makes you think of modern passwords, modern key cards, modern little hoops you jump through to prove you're allowed in the building. Humans do not change much. We just change the materials and pretend we invented authority. Now the ceremony shifts. A small offering is carried to a nearby shrine. Incense is lit. Words are spoken softly. The crowd does not hear every syllable, but they recognize the form. And this is where departure protocol can be interpreted as a sacred handover procedure. The city is not only installing a king, it is renewing the connection between the throne and the temple. It is confirming that the divine presence, however understood, remains engaged with the city's life. A more cautious explanation could be that these rites are simply tradition, performed because they have always been performed. But it is possible that tradition also serves as psychological insurance. When the world feels fragile, repeating the correct sequence gives people a sense of stability. Ritual is a way of saying, we still know what to do. You look at the faces in the crowd. Some are hopeful, some are skeptical, some are just here for the bread and the chance to stand in the shade, and honestly, respect. Not everyone attends state ceremonies for spiritual enlightenment. Some people attend because their cousin promised there would be snacks. That is timeless too. The king takes a cup, drinks, and then pours a little on the ground. The gesture is small, but it carries a sense of pledge. The scribe records something. Another official nods. A priest watches closely. It is a choreography of trust. Now you allow a cinematic what if, gently labeled as imagination. What if, hidden inside the official words, there is also an unspoken fear? What if the city remembers times when divine favor felt gone, when crops failed, when enemies approached, when people whispered that the gods had turned away? What if the coronation is designed not only to celebrate power, but to prevent abandonment? What if it is a ritual that says, please stay, without ever needing to say those words directly? You move away from the platform and wander along a side street, where officials gather around another cluster of tablets. This looks less like religion and more like administration. Names are called, duties assigned, rations recorded. Most historians agree that ration systems and recorded distributions exist in Mesopotamian administrative texts. The evidence we do have points to organized management of workers, including allocations of grain, beer, and oil. The city runs on these lists, and that introduces another new development that keeps the listener engaged. Maybe the departure protocol is not only about gods or kings. Maybe it is about what happens when authority shifts and people need their rations to continue without interruption. A clerk reads from a tablet and points at a group of workers. Someone grumbles. Someone laughs. The clerk does not laugh. The clerk has the emotional range of a stone doorway. You almost admire it. One interpretation is that the paperwork itself is part of sacred order, in a society where the gods are seen as upholding cosmic structure. The temple and palace bureaucracy can be understood as an earthly mirror of that structure. Lists, seals, oaths, and distributions are not random. They are the city's way of imitating the order the gods represent. So if divine presence is thought to withdraw, the response might be to tighten procedures, to perform order more intensely, to prove the city is still worthy of protection. Here comes a quirky tidbit, framed safely. A fringe idea proposes that some formulaic lines in royal inscriptions are deliberately crafted as protective locks, meaning the right words must be spoken in the right order to keep authority stable. This is debated and not widely accepted as literal mechanism, but as a lens, it is interesting. It treats language like infrastructure, not magic in a modern fantasy sense, but language as a tool that shapes reality through collective belief and repeated practice. You watch an official press a new seal into clay, and then hold the tablet up to the light to check the impression. The image is crisp, the act is satisfying, like stamping a document and finally feeling the day's work become real. If you have ever clicked submit on an online form and felt your soul leave your body, you understand the spiritual dimension of bureaucracy. Not glamorous, but powerful. The crowd begins to disperse. Merchants return to their stalls. Workers return to tasks. Children chase a bit of string. A dog finds a shady spot and commits to a nap with the seriousness of a professional. You follow a lane toward a smaller shrine, away from the public ceremony, and here the mood turns quieter. Inside the shrine, a priest arranges offerings in a careful pattern. The priest speaks low, as if the walls are listening. The offerings are modest, but their intent is precise. Most historians agree that offerings and ritual care form a central part of Mesopotamian religious practice. The evidence we do have points to regular rites, festivals, and prayers meant to maintain proper relationships with deities. Now the departure protocol idea becomes intimate. What if a tablet exists that tells a priest what to do when a shrine feels empty, when the usual signs of favor are missing? Again, that is not a confirmed scenario. It's possible that texts about abandonment or withdrawal are literary devices, not literal reports. But the emotional logic is strong. People have always asked, where did the help go? And then written instructions for how to invite it back. You picture a tablet with steps that sound like comfort disguised as procedure. Prepare water, light incense, speak the names, offer bread, sing the hymn, close the doors, record the act. Wait, not because the cosmos is a vending machine, but because doing something is easier than doing nothing when you are scared. You step outside again and feel the day settling into its ordinary pace. The city's power is not only in its walls or its kings, it is in its habits. The solid ground is that Sumerian society uses writing for administration and ritual, and that kingship is bound up with divine legitimacy. The mist is the question of how literally to take departure language when it appears in texts. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You walk past a small table where a scribe is smoothing a fresh clay surface. The reed stylus lies beside it, simple and patient. The scribe looks up, yawns, and goes back to work. You get a final soft joke, because sleep likes a little smile. Imagine being the person who has to write. The fate of the city depends on this, while also remembering to spell the king's name correctly. That is pressure, and you let the square fade behind you, carrying one calm idea into the dark. In a world built on contracts between humans and the sacred, a departure protocol can be understood as a set of structured acts meant to prevent rupture, whether it describes God's legitimacy or the fragile psychology of a city. It is a way of turning fear into steps, and steps, when paced slowly, can lead you gently toward rest. You climb a narrow staircase that smells like sun-warmed brick and old dust, and the city noise thins out the higher you go. Each step is shallow, built for steady feet, not sprinting heroes. You reach a rooftop terrace where the air feels cleaner, and a soft wind brushes your face like a cool cloth. Up here, you can hear the world in layers. Far below, faint voices and animals. Around you, the flutter of a loose reed mat. Above you, the wide sky, already turning from blue to a deep, patient dusk. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian societies paid close attention to the heavens, developing calendars and keeping track of time in ways that shaped farming, festivals, and administration. The evidence we do have points to careful observation of the moon, the sun, and the changing seasons. This is not a random hobby. In a river valley, timing is survival. Plant too early, and the crop sulks. Plant too late, and the crop laughs at you and refuses. You learn quickly that nature does not care about your schedule. So, you make a better schedule. You stand near a low table where someone has laid out simple tools. A bowl of water that reflects the sky, a straight stick, a cord with knots, a small tablet with lines drawn across it. Nothing flashy, just practical geometry. One interpretation is that many early astronomical and calendrical practices begin as grounded, repetitive observations that get recorded because they matter for communal planning. You watch a priest-scholar type, not wearing a lab coat, but carrying the same quiet seriousness. He checks the horizon. He glances at the tablet. He marks something with a stylus. It is calm work, almost soothing. The kind of work that makes you sleepy because it is so consistent. Night after night. You note where the moon rises. You count how many days until it returns to a particular shape. You notice the bright wandering lights that do not behave like the other stars. You do not call them planets yet in a modern way, but you notice their strange paths. You keep notes. You compare notes. You adjust. Most historians agree that these observations become intertwined with religious meaning. That does not mean every observer thinks the stars are literally gods waving at them. It means the sky is a powerful symbol system, and people naturally connect patterns above to patterns below. Festivals are set by moon phases. Offerings align with sacred days. Administrative deadlines may follow the calendar. The temple, which already loves lists, also loves dates. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient texts speak in procedural language, they sometimes tie that procedure to time markers. Not only do this, but do this on this day, under this moon, after this sign. That is where departure protocol starts to sound like scheduling. In a modern office, you do not just resign. You hand in your badge by Friday at 5. You do not just end a project. You close it at the end of the quarter. So if a ritual is meant to mark a shift in divine presence, one interpretation is that it will be pinned to the calendar the way everything important is pinned. You watch the sky deepen. The first stars appear, faint at first, then sharper. A boy on a nearby roof points upward and counts under his breath, and you can tell he is trying to impress someone. Classic move. He says a number confidently, then realizes he lost count, then pretends he meant that number anyway. The human species has always been brave in the face of mathematics. You sit down on the edge of the terrace and let the breeze cool your shoulders. The city below begins to light small lamps, one by one. The lamps look like fireflies, and the river beyond reflects a long ribbon of fading light. Now the story takes a new development that keeps your mind engaged. Instead of focusing on temples and kings, you focus on time as a governing force. A protocol, at its core, is a sequence. A sequence has an order. An order implies timing. So a departure protocol could be less about footsteps leaving and more about the correct moment to perform a transition rite. Whether that transition is seasonal, political, or spiritual. The priest-scholar lifts the bowl of water and sets it down carefully. He uses it like a mirror, checking the angle of a star. This is not fantasy. Reflective surfaces are a practical way to observe without craning your neck. The evidence we do have suggests Mesopotamian scholars recorded celestial phenomena and linked them to omens and calendar keeping, especially in later periods, though practices evolve over time. You keep the solid ground under you. Observation, recording, pattern. Historians still argue whether early celestial observation in Sumerian contexts was mainly a pragmatic calendar tool, an omen system guiding decisions, or a more symbolic ritual language that shaped how people interpreted history. You let the argument drift. Tonight it can be all three, depending on the moment. You notice the tablet on the table has columns, and the priest-scholar points to one line, then another. It looks like a schedule, a list of days, marks that could be counted, a place for notes. One interpretation is that a lot of ancient knowledge is structured in lists, because lists are portable and teachable. If you can write it as a list, you can hand it to another person. You can preserve it beyond your own memory. You can make it part of the institution. Now you let in a little mist, carefully labeled. A popular rumor claims that some ritual calendars were also coded messages, that certain dates and star references were a way of hiding instructions in plain sight. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is a delicious human suspicion. Because whenever people see a schedule, they do not fully understand. They assume it is either genius or a conspiracy. Sometimes it is just a schedule. Sometimes it is genius scheduling, which is still boring, but in an impressive way. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine a tablet that looks like a festival calendar, but also doubles as a set of their conditions. If the moon is new, perform a cleansing. If the moon is full, perform a procession. If a certain star rises at a certain time, recite a protective hymn. None of that requires literal departing gods. It requires a belief that timing matters, and timing always matters. You watch the priest-scholar consult another person, a junior observer with ink-stained fingers and sleepy eyes. The junior holds a tablet and yawns, then tries to cover it by coughing. Subtle. The priest does not react. The priest has seen this trick for decades. Another gentle joke lands in your mind. Imagine having the job title Professional Stargazer, but also the responsibility of making sure the harvest festival happens on the right day. Because if you get it wrong, half the city will glare at you. Your hobbies become everyone's deadlines. That is the real horror. The junior points to a mark on the tablet, and the priest nods. They speak quietly. You cannot hear the words clearly, but you can sense the tone. Careful, precise, slightly worried. That worry is understandable. In societies where celestial events are connected to omens, a strange sky can feel like a warning. A lunar eclipse, a comet, a weird halo around the moon. These can shake confidence. A more cautious explanation could be that omen texts and interpretations develop strongly later, but even early on, the sky is meaningful. People notice unusual things and talk about them. Now you shift your focus to the moon. It hangs low, pale and steady, like a coin held up to the dark. The moon is the easiest calendar tool because it changes in a visible cycle. Months can be counted by lunations. The evidence we do have points to lunar-based month systems being common in the region. That gives you a plausible place for departure protocol language to latch on. A departure could be timed to the end of a month, the end of a year, the start of a festival season. The god leaves in mythic language when a cycle closes. Then the god returns when the cycle opens again. One interpretation is that stories of divine movement can function like metaphors for cyclical time. The god travels, the god returns, the city renews, the world continues. That is not a claim of literal travel. It is a way of teaching that seasons shift and order must be maintained through ritual. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits how myths often work in many cultures. You lean back and let your eyes trace the stars. The shapes are not yet constellations in the modern named set, but humans cannot resist connecting dots. You notice how the sky invites stories. You see a curve that could be a boat, a cluster that could be a crown, a bright point that could be a watchful eye. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. Now comes the third joke, small and sleepy. You think about how the stars are always in the right place, on time, never late. Meanwhile, you, as a modern human, can be late to an appointment that is literally on a device that screams at you. The stars would judge you, but kindly, because they are old and tired of drama. The priest-scholar stands and lifts a hand, indicating a particular star rising at the edge of the world. The junior marks the tablet. Their movements are slow, deliberate, and you realize something that feels like a new piece of the puzzle. Protocols are not only written, they are performed. The writing is a memory aid, but the real protocol lives in repeated embodied action. In this moment, the protocol is a gesture, a look, a mark, a nod. The departure, if it exists, is not a dramatic exit. It is a shift in phase, a change in the schedule, a transition from one state to another. A fringe idea proposes that departure protocols in ancient texts could be remnants of an older tradition where the gods were imagined as physically traveling along heavenly routes, like officials moving between cities, with the stars acting as road signs. This is debated, and not widely accepted as literal description. But it can be explored as symbolic storytelling, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a poetic way to say that the sacred has rhythms. It comes close. It moves away. It returns. It is never fully pinned down. You notice the temple in the distance has a small light burning higher than the others. A beacon, steady and warm. It is a comforting sight. The city may be busy, but the night is orderly. Lamps are lit. Doors are closed. People settle somewhere. Someone is singing a low song. You walk along the rooftop and find a small niche where another observer sits alone, holding a tablet on his knees. He's not watching stars. He's counting, quietly. 1, 2, 3. Then a pause. Then he starts again. The counting is not frantic. It is meditative. Counting days is a way of feeling control in a world where storms and floods can erase plans overnight. The evidence we do have points to ancient societies using timekeeping as a tool of governance, because organizing labor, festivals, and rations requires predictable intervals. This is where the departure protocol concept can become even more grounded. If a ritual is required to renew divine favor, it may be scheduled. If a king must perform a rite at a certain time to maintain legitimacy, it may be scheduled. If a temple must do purification after a particular omen, it may be scheduled. The protocol is the plan for time, and the departure is the end of a phase. Historians still argue whether we should read celestial references in myths as literal observations embedded in story, symbolic language with no intent to record astronomy, or a blend where practical observation and mythic imagination feed each other. You let that line drift into the wind. You do not need to choose. The lonely counter looks up at you, then down at his tablet, then back up, as if deciding whether you are real. In a dreamlike scene, you are always real enough. He gestures to the horizon. You follow his finger. The moon is slightly higher now. Time has moved, even in this sleepy, slow motion. That movement is the point. The sky changes. The city changes with it. You sit beside him and listen. He begins to speak softly, as if reciting a list. The names might be months. The words might be festival titles. The phrases might be instructions. It's possible he is rehearsing the calendar the way you rehearse a phone number. The repetition is a kind of safety. He does not want to forget. Forgetting would mean disorder. Now you allow one cinematic what-if, gentle and clearly imagined. What if a tablet labeled as a calendar contains a quiet final sequence, a set of steps reserved for a rare moment, a moment when the temple declares a pause, a closing, a withdrawal? What if that sequence is what later minds call a departure protocol? Not because gods fly away, but because the institution needs to mark a discontinuity, a ritual shutdown, a controlled retreat, a way to say, tonight we stop, and tomorrow we begin again. Without letting panic fill the gap, you breathe in the cool night air and feel your shoulders loosen. The sky remains vast and indifferent, but the human mind makes it personal anyway. That is not a flaw. It is a comfort. As you leave the rooftop, the city below hums softly, and the lamps blur into a gentle glow. You carry a calm thought into your rest. Timing is a kind of language. Calendars are a kind of memory. And if ancient texts sometimes sound like protocols, it may be because the people who wrote them were trying to keep life aligned with rhythms larger than any single person. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we'll let the stars do what they always do, hold steady while you drift. You walk along a canal path where the earth is darker, damp in patches, and the air carries that river smell that is both fresh and a little muddy, like the world is being honest about where life comes from. Reeds sway in slow waves at the water's edge. Frogs make tiny clicking sounds. Somewhere nearby, a water bird flaps up with a lazy complaint, as if you disturbed its very important plan to do absolutely nothing. Most historians agree that the rivers of Mesopotamia can be both generous and destructive, and that floods and shifting channels shape settlement, farming, and memory. The evidence we do have points to real environmental challenges in the region, including unpredictable flooding, and it is broadly accepted that communities develop systems, physical and cultural, to cope with that risk. Canals, levees, irrigation ditches, storage and schedules, practical defenses, and also stories. Because when the water rises too fast, you do not just rebuild your walls, you rebuild your sense of meaning. You follow the canal to a low gate where someone has placed stones carefully, forming a small barrier. A worker lifts a wooden board to let water through in a controlled flow. It is a simple mechanism, but it is a form of power. Control the water, and you control the harvest. Control the harvest, and you control the city's mood. The worker wipes sweat from his brow and squints at the current. His expression says, "Please behave," addressed to the river, as if it can hear. One interpretation is that flood traditions in ancient Mesopotamia are not only tales of destruction, they are cultural memory devices. They package a real risk into a story that can be repeated, taught, and used as a warning. When a society keeps repeating flood stories, it might be processing trauma, but it also might be training its people to respect the water. A more cautious explanation could be that different flood narratives serve different literary and religious purposes, and that not every story maps neatly to a single historical event. Still, the underlying reality of floods is not in doubt. You pass a small shrine near the canal, barely more than a niche with a clay offering bowl. Someone has left a handful of dates and a little bit of bread. Not lavish, but sincere. The shrine feels like an apology to the river, or a request, or both. You can almost sense the logic. If the water is life, you treat it with reverence. If the water is danger, you treat it with reverence again, just with slightly shakier hands. This is where the departure protocol idea takes a new shape, one tied to emergency thinking. When modern people imagine a protocol, they often picture an evacuation plan, an emergency checklist, a binder labeled "if things go wrong." In a flood-prone world, emergency procedures are not optional. They are as important as grain storage. So one interpretation is that some ritual instructions and temple procedures could double as disaster response, a structured way to keep the people calm and coordinated when the river turns wild. You walk into a neighborhood built a little higher, on raised ground. The houses have thick walls, and you notice that the door thresholds are slightly elevated, as if to discourage water. Children run past you with a clay toy boat, pushing it along a shallow puddle. They are laughing, but the toy is also a tiny rehearsal. Boats are not just playthings in a place where water can take over. The toy skims along, and the kids cheer when it doesn't tip. You smile, and you let a small joke settle in. Even ancient children are basically quality assurance testers for the universe. Most historians agree that communities in Mesopotamia used both engineering and organization to manage water. The evidence we do have points to coordinated labor for canal maintenance, levee repair, and agricultural scheduling. That coordination requires leadership, records, and routines. And when a flood threatens, those routines shift into a different mode. Emergency mode. A protocol. Now you find yourself in a large courtyard where villagers gather, and the mood is tense. Dark clouds pile on the horizon, and the wind is changing. Someone points toward the river. Someone else holds a tablet and reads a message out loud. It sounds like instruction. Move stored goods to higher shelves, secure the boats, reinforce the barrier, notify the temple, notify the palace. The words are plain and practical. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient texts describe rituals performed during crises, they may be doing two things at once. They may be asking for divine help, and they may be coordinating human action. That is not contradictory. In many cultures, ritual can organize people, focus attention, and create a shared plan. So a departure protocol could be understood as a crisis protocol. A set of steps followed when divine protection feels uncertain and the environment is hostile. Historians still argue whether the strongest language of divine abandonment in Mesopotamian literature reflects lived experiences of catastrophe, a standard literary motif used to dramatize loss, or a ritual pattern meant to guide communities through recovery. You let that debate float above the courtyard like the gathering clouds. You do not need to pick a side to feel the emotional truth that floods are scary. You watch as an elder speaks to the crowd. His voice is slow, steady. He is not promising miracles. He is offering steps. People listen. Some nod. Some look away toward the river. A woman ties her hair back with a strip of cloth. Practical, ready. A man checks a rope, testing it with his weight. Someone else starts moving jars. Now the mist arrives, but with a soft disclaimer. A popular rumor claims that certain temple rituals were originally designed as evacuation drills, disguised as religious ceremonies, so people would practice them regularly without resentment. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for intent is hard to pin down. But as a thought experiment, it is interesting. If you tell people, "We are practicing disaster response," they might roll their eyes. If you tell people, "This is sacred and must be done exactly," they will show up on time. Human motivation is funny, not always admirable, but effective. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can picture a ritual procession that also maps the safest route to higher ground. A set of purification steps that also ensures clean water and organized supplies. A chant that keeps people calm while they work. A list of offerings that doubles as an inventory of stored food. Again, not proven, just a lens. You walk with a group heading toward the temple storerooms. The doors are opened. Inside, the air is cool and smells like grain and oil. Clay jars sit in neat rows. Baskets of dried goods are stacked carefully. This is a city's insurance policy. Most historians agree that storage and redistribution are central to temple economies, and that keeping surplus is vital for surviving bad seasons. The evidence we do have supports the existence of organized storage, rationing, and record keeping. A clerk checks a tablet, calling out counts. Another clerk marks adjustments. Workers lift jars onto higher platforms. The movement is efficient, almost rehearsed. That is the key new development. The city has done this before. Even if this particular storm is new, the pattern of response is not. This is what protocols are for. They make the unfamiliar feel familiar. Now the river sound grows louder. The wind carries a fine spray. People glance upward as the first heavy drops fall. The rain hits the courtyard in fat, impatient beats. Everyone moves faster, but not in chaos. They move in a pattern. The elders' steps, the clerk's lists, the workers' routes, the temple's doors, the storage plan. It is all a system. One interpretation is that the ancient concept of divine presence and absence could be tied to environmental stability. When the river is controlled, the gods are thought to be pleased. When the river breaks loose, people might interpret it as a disruption in cosmic order. That does not mean they ignore practical solutions. It means practical solutions and sacred meaning intertwine. A more cautious explanation could be that theological interpretations vary widely. But the emotional impulse is consistent. Humans want reasons. Humans want rituals. Humans want plans. Now you allow a cinematic what-if, clearly imagined. What if a tablet exists that is pulled from a shelf only when the water rises beyond a certain mark? The tablet is old, its edges smoothed by many hands. It contains steps. Some are practical, like where to move supplies and who to notify. Some are ritual, like which hymns to sing and which offerings to make. The combined effect is a calm choreography. What if this is what someone later calls a departure protocol? Because in the middle of a flood, it can feel like protection itself has stepped away, and the city must perform the steps that invite it back. A fringe idea proposes that some flood stories encode not only memory, but precise environmental observations, such as flood heights, seasonal patterns, and warning signs. This is debated and not widely accepted as exact encoding, but it can be explored as an interpretation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see myths as a kind of survival manual written in poetic language. Not because the authors are hiding secrets, but because poetry is easier to remember than raw data. You can forget a number. You might remember a story. The rain intensifies. The canal swells. People check barriers. Someone ties a boat more securely. Someone else carries a child to higher ground. There is no screaming. There is urgency, but also discipline. And you feel that discipline as a kind of comfort. Here comes a small, sleepy joke to soften the scene. You notice a dog refusing to move from its dry spot, even as everyone else rearranges the world. The dog looks at the rain like it is personally offended. If the dog had a tablet, it would read, Protocol Step 1. Do not get wet. You step into a sheltered alcove and listen to the rain on the roof, a steady drumming that becomes almost hypnotic. The elder speaks again, slower now, encouraging steady work, steady breath. The people respond. They do the steps. They trust the system. Historians still argue whether the strongest flood narratives should be understood as reflections of single catastrophic events, accumulated memories of many floods, or symbolic tales that express moral and cosmic ideas more than environmental history. You let that sentence drift into the sound of rain. Uncertainty is fine. The rain does not care about your certainty. It falls either way. As the storm begins to ease, the courtyard smells clean, like wet clay and crushed leaves. People pause. They check on each other. They count supplies. The clerks update tablets. The temple doors close again, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a simple containment of order. You walk back toward the canal, now calmer, still swollen, but within its banks. The reeds are heavy with water droplets. The sky is clearing. A thin strip of sunset appears, pale gold. The city exhales, and you carry away the new understanding that keeps tonight's story moving. In a flood-shaped world, procedures matter. Ritual and administration can blend into a single response system. A departure protocol might be a poetic way of describing the steps taken when protection feels uncertain, and the community needs a script to follow. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we'll let the river settle while you settle too. You slip into a quieter quarter of the city where the streets narrow and the shadows deepen, even though the sun still lingers at the edge of the day. The air smells like baked brick and faint smoke, the kind that clings to fabric and hair without asking permission. You pass a wall covered in small impressions where hands have pressed wet clay long ago, leaving dimples like fingerprints of people who had no idea they were leaving messages for you. Most historians agree that the term Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian traditions as a group of powerful divine figures, and that their roles shift across time, texts, and regions. The evidence we do have points to them being part of a broader divine order, often connected to authority, destiny, and the structured hierarchy of the cosmos. See, that is the solid ground. It is real, documented in the sense that the name exists in ancient sources and has been studied for generations. Now you step into the misty zone carefully, because this is where modern curiosity tends to sprint ahead of evidence, trip over its own shoelaces, and then insist the fall was part of the plan. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki serve as a narrative device for explaining why power feels larger than any single human ruler. Another interpretation is that they reflect theological ideas about fate and cosmic administration. And then there is the modern fascination, where the Anunnaki are sometimes recast as literal visitors, engineers, or outsiders. That modern lens is popular, but it is debated, and it is not widely accepted in mainstream scholarship. You walk into a small scribal workshop that smells like damp clay and bitter beer. A few apprentices are sorting tablets into baskets. Their hands are dusty, their faces serious. A teacher sits on a low stool, reading aloud from a tablet, with a voice that is steady and slightly bored, which is honestly the perfect tone for ancient wisdom. The teacher is not trying to impress anyone. The teacher is trying to keep the signs correct, because the signs are how the world stays legible. A tablet near you contains a list of divine names and titles, not a dramatic narrative, more like a catalogue. This is a new development for the listener because it shifts the Anunnaki from flashy myth to administrative reality. Lists of gods, epithets, and offerings are a core part of how ancient religion operates day to day. If you want a modern comparison, it is like a company org chart mixed with a holiday gift registry. Who gets what, when, why, and who is responsible if it does not happen. Nobody wants to be the one who forgot to schedule the monthly offering for a major deity. because that is the ancient equivalent of forgetting to pay the electric bill. Archaeology suggests that many religious practices are embedded in institutions. And institutions love lists. So when you see divine group names in a list, it can mean the tradition is functioning as a system, not only as a story. That matters for the phrase departure protocol, because a protocol makes most sense in a system. You do not write a protocol for a vague mood. You write it for a role, a process, a handover, a chain of responsibility. You watch the teacher point to a line and explain a term. The apprentices repeat it. Their voices blend into a soft, rhythmic murmur. It is calming, like waves, like a fan hum, like rain in another life. This is the atmosphere where mystery can grow without turning into fear. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. One interpretation is that God's leaving language could be a theological way to describe a withdrawal of divine presence or protection. In that context, an Anunnaki reference might function like a stamp of authority. A group name can signal that a decision has cosmic weight. A protocol associated with such figures would feel more serious, more official. That does not require literal departure. It requires a worldview where divine order can shift, and where the community needs steps to respond. Now, the modern fascination arrives, wearing sunglasses indoors and insisting it is totally normal. A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki were not simply gods in a religious sense, but literal beings who came from elsewhere and left behind instructions. A so-called departure protocol for those who remained. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin when you measure it against mainstream translations and archaeological context. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about how modern minds reinterpret ancient language through modern expectations. People read descending, ascending, heaven, and earth, and their imaginations fill in images from science fiction and modern technology. You stroll past a shelf where tablets are stacked like small loaves. Some are smooth and rectangular, some are irregular, some are cracked, repaired by time with invisible glue. You pick one up carefully in your imagination and feel the weight. It is heavier than you expect. A reminder that knowledge used to be physical labor. Your wrists would get strong just from filing paperwork. Ancient fitness plan. Lift clay, repeat daily. The teacher begins reciting a mythic passage, and the tone changes. The words become more poetic, more ceremonial. You hear a phrase that could be interpreted as a divine assembly, a council, a group of great powers making decisions. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian myth often includes divine councils and hierarchical structures. That is documented territory, even if the details vary by text and period. And here is the careful pivot. One interpretation is that a divine council scene mirrors the human political world. Kings have councils, temples have committees, cities have assemblies. So the gods, in story, also have meetings. It is a way of expressing order. It can also be a way of expressing uncertainty, because when a council meets, something is being decided, and decisions can change everything. Now you meet the phrase that keeps the section honest and monetization safe, spoken softly, but clearly. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki should be understood as a consistent, clearly defined group across all periods, or as a flexible label that shifts meaning depending on the text region, and theological fashion. Good. You let that settle. Debate exists. No need for absolutes. You leave the workshop and step into a courtyard where a small ritual is being performed. A priest stands before a modest altar. Not grand, not theatrical. The priest pours a little liquid into a bowl, then raises his hands briefly. A few witnesses watch, silent. This is not a spectacle. It is maintenance. That is another new development for the listener. Religion here is not only myth. It is routine care. It is scheduled attention. It is the daily act of keeping relationships stable. One interpretation is that departure protocol could be tied to the maintenance of divine presence, especially if a community believes the god's favor can drift when neglected. If the Anunnaki represent high-level divine authority, then references to them might appear in texts that deal with major transitions, major fears, or major repairs to cosmic balance. Again, suggestive, not conclusive. Now the mist offers a cinematic what-if, clearly framed as imagination. What if a temple archive contains a tablet that is read only in rare circumstances, perhaps during political upheaval, perhaps during a crisis of legitimacy, perhaps after a troubling omen? The tablet begins with names that sound like a formal address, invoking powerful divine figures. Then it outlines steps, not just prayers, but actions. Close certain doors, open certain gates, increase offerings, purify certain objects, restrict access to inner rooms, record the sequence, seal the result. This would feel like a protocol, a structured response to perceived instability. You do not claim this tablet exists as described. You simply allow the mood. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient terms, when translated loosely, can be made to sound like modern technology, and that this could point to a literal advanced presence in the distant past. This is debated and not widely accepted, but it persists because language is slippery, and because humans love a clever reinterpretation, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The more interesting question becomes psychological. Why do modern people want the gods to be engineers? Perhaps because it feels safer to imagine that someone had a plan, a manual, a protocol, even if that someone is not human. You wander through a small market lane where vendors are packing up for the evening. Someone is selling tiny carved amulets. Someone else sells oil lamps. A child tries to negotiate for a sweet, using the ancient and eternal argument. But I am small, as if size is a currency. The vendor pretends to consider it seriously. Another sleepy joke slides in. If the Anunnaki were truly cosmic administrators, they would take one look at human bargaining and immediately request a transfer to a quieter galaxy. You stop by a stall displaying cylinder seals. The images are intricate, tiny scenes of figures and symbols. Archaeology suggests these seals were practical tools for marking ownership and authenticity, but they also carried iconography that could be religious or political. A careful reading might suggest that seals function like a bridge between the human and the divine. A king seals a tablet with a scene of divine support. A merchant seals a container with a symbol that implies protection. The image becomes a small statement about order. This is where the departure protocol notion can feel less like a dramatic story and more like a system of access. In systems, departure, and arrival are often about permissions. Who is allowed in? Who is allowed out? Who is authorized to act? A protocol could be the procedure by which sacred authority is transferred, acknowledged, or temporarily suspended. That is mainstream compatible. It fits how institutions behave. Now you walk toward a gate at the edge of the city, where the walls are thick and the guards are relaxed. Beyond the gate, the landscape opens into fields and distant river lines, and the sky above is turning deep purple. You pause and look back at the city lights. The city feels like a machine made of people and belief, running on grain, water, and ritual. You consider one more modern rumor, presented gently. A popular rumor claims that the gods left language is evidence of an actual departure event, a moment when something extraordinary withdrew from human contact and left instructions behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has staying power because it turns ancient ambiguity into a clean plot. Beginning, middle, end, arrival, rule, departure. Humans love a story with a neat arc. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient texts use vivid metaphor to describe political loss, environmental disaster, or shifts in religious focus, and that later readers sometimes mistake metaphor for report. The evidence we do have points to complex literary traditions, not simple logbooks of literal events. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Gaps remain, fragments remain, translation choices remain, and the mind, especially a tired mind, wants to fill the gaps. You let yourself feel the calm edge of that uncertainty. The breeze outside the gate is cooler. It smells like wet soil and plants settling for the night. You hear insects beginning their steady chorus. The guards talk quietly among themselves, and one of them yawns so widely it looks like he might swallow the moon. You relate? One last gentle joke for your drifting brain. Imagine being a divine being tasked with writing a departure protocol for humans, and then watching humans immediately argue about the footnotes for 3,000 years. Even the gods would need a nap. You turn from the gate and walk into the fields, letting the city's complexity soften behind you. The solid ground remains that the Anunnaki are part of Mesopotamian religious language, and that the texts we have reflect institutions, myths, and practices shaped by human needs. The mist remains the modern reimagining of these figures as literal outsiders with manuals and exit plans. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and in the quiet, as the sky deepens and the air cools, you allow the idea of a protocol to become what it always is, a human attempt to make change survivable, whether the change is political, spiritual, or simply the slow turning of the night. You enter a part of the city that feels like it has its own heartbeat, measured in footsteps through archways. The streets here are tighter, the walls higher, and the gates more frequent, as if the neighborhood is a sequence of rooms rather than open roads. Torches flicker in brackets. The air smells like resin and warm stone. Each turn leads to another threshold, another doorway, another place where you pause without meaning to, because the architecture asks you to slow down. Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamian cities managed movement through gates, courtyards, and controlled entrances, and that sealing practices helped regulate ownership and access. The evidence we do have points to a society that takes boundaries seriously. Not only physical boundaries, like walls, but social ones. Who belongs in which space? Who is allowed to touch which object? Who may speak which words at which time? You stop at a gate where a guard sits on a stool, casually twirling a reed in his fingers. He is not threatening. He is bored, which is the real sign that the system is stable. On the wall behind him, a small clay plaque bears markings, and maybe a symbol, a seal impression, a name, an identifier. The guard taps it lightly, like it is a reminder. Rules exist. Do not pretend you forgot. You step through and find a workshop filled with tiny objects. Someone is carving a cylinder seal, bent close to the stone with intense concentration. The tool in his hand is small, but the work is delicate, precise. He pauses, blows dust off the carving, and leans in again. This is a new development for the listener. Instead of focusing on big temples and big myths, you focus on the technology of trust. The seal is not only art, it is authentication. It is the ancient equivalent of signing your name and locking a door at the same time. Most historians agree that names and titles mattered intensely in Mesopotamian society, and that writing and sealing helped formalize identity and authority. The evidence we do have points to officials, merchants, and institutions using seals to mark containers and tablets. So when you think about a departure protocol, you can frame it as a question of access. When something important leaves, who is authorized to act? Who can open the storeroom? Who can enter the inner chamber? Who can speak the formal words that change a status from present to absent? One interpretation is that many repeated phrases in ritual texts function like authorized speech, the correct formula that turns a moment into an official moment. You can feel it in your own life. I now pronounce you changes reality. You are hired changes reality. This meeting is adjourned changes reality. Words are not just air. In structured societies, words are keys. You walk deeper into the workshop and see a small pile of practice tablets near a basket. The wedges are clumsy at first, then better, then clean and confident. Someone is learning how to write names. Someone is learning how to write titles. Someone is learning how to write the phrases that open and close procedures. It is calming. Watching skill build in tiny increments. The reed stylus presses. The clay yields. The line appears. The world becomes slightly more organized. Now the mystery angle arrives in a fresh way, without relying on old suspense. You notice that some tablets repeat divine names in a specific order, not random, not poetic, ordered. A careful reading might suggest this order is purposeful. Perhaps it reflects hierarchy. Perhaps it reflects ritual sequence. Perhaps it reflects local custom. Or perhaps it functions like a verbal lock, a sequence you must recite correctly to be recognized as legitimate within the ritual system. Historians still argue whether repeated divine name sequences in ritual contexts are mainly mnemonic devices for priests, symbolic affirmations of cosmic order, or intentional authorization, formulas that signal who has the right to perform a rite. You let that debate hang gently in the air like incense. No panic, no certainty, just a possibility. You leave the workshop and follow a narrow passage to a small administrative gate. A clerk sits behind a low table, and you can tell his job is to say no. His posture is the posture of someone who has turned denial into an art form. People approach with jars, bundles, and requests. He checks tablets. He checks seals. He nods or shakes his head. The gate is not a dramatic barrier. It is a bureaucratic filter. One interpretation is that the sense of sacred mystery around certain places is reinforced by administrative control. If only certain people can enter, the place feels powerful. If only certain people can touch a statue, the statue feels alive. Control creates aura. That is not a supernatural claim. It is a social mechanic, and it fits the departure protocol theme, because departures are often about changing who has access. When someone leaves, someone else gains or loses permission. A clerk hands a visitor a small clay tag. The visitor ties it to a bundle. The tag probably identifies contents, owner, or destination. Archaeology suggests labeling and tagging systems existed, and that administrative life relied on such small tools. You watch the visitor walk away, and you realize how much of civilization is held together by tiny, easily lost objects. A tag, a seal, a name, a cord. Lose the tag, and suddenly, nobody knows whose barley this is, and the argument begins, and the gods, if they are listening, sigh loudly. Now you move toward a religious gate, not the main temple entrance, but a side door guarded more carefully. The guard stands straighter. He looks at hands, not faces, as if checking for dust, for offerings, for the right objects. You approach and feel your breathing slow. This doorway is smaller, but it feels heavier. You sense the presence of rules. A popular rumor claims that certain gates in ancient temple complexes required spoken phrases, not just physical seals, like a verbal password system. This theory isn't widely accepted in a literal sense, and evidence is hard to pin down. But as an interpretation, it aligns with how ritual works. Words can function like credentials. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine a priest whispering a formula at the threshold, not to unlock a mechanical latch, but to mark the transition as legitimate. You pass through and find a chamber with shelves holding ceremonial objects. There is a sense of quiet pressure in the air, like you should not cough too loudly. A priest is arranging items in a specific order, and you can tell the order matters. He places a bowl, then a cloth, then a small figurine, then a bundle of reeds. The reeds appear again, humble and useful. They are always there, like the background hum of the whole culture. Most historians agree that ritual objects and their arrangement can be significant in ancient religions. And the evidence we do have points to structured ceremonies with prescribed sequences. So you watch the priest and notice the pattern. Arrange, purify, speak, offer, record, seal, store. It is a loop, and loops are comforting. Now the new development lands with a satisfying click. The concept of protocol may not be about a big dramatic departure at all. It may be about the ongoing management of transitions through gates. Gates between spaces. Gates between statuses. Gates between purity states. Gates between ordinary life and sacred action. If a god leaves in a text, the leaving might be represented as passing through a threshold. The protocol could be the correct way to manage that threshold. One interpretation is that in mythic language, The movement of a deity can symbolize the movement of power, legitimacy, or protection. The god goes through a gate. The city feels vulnerable. The people respond with ritual steps that re-establish order. Again, suggestive, not conclusive. You step back into the corridor and hear a soft, scraping sound. A scribe is making a copy of a ritual text, and each wedge lands with quiet precision. The scribe pauses to wet the tip of the reed, then continues. The rhythm is hypnotic. If you were listening to it with your eyes closed, you could mistake it for tiny raindrops hitting a window. Now you allow one cinematic what-if, clearly framed as imagination. What if a temple keeps a tablet that lists the names to be spoken at each threshold, like stations on a route? At gate 1, invoke this. At gate 2, purify with that. At gate 3, seal the object. At gate 4, record the act. The sequence would feel like a departure protocol if it described a sacred presence moving outward, away from the innermost chamber. But it could also be a protocol for a procession, for maintenance, for protection, for any ritual that requires careful movement through controlled spaces. A fringe idea proposes that some name sequences are intentionally arranged to conceal secondary meanings, like acrostics or coded hierarchies, and that the true message is hidden in the order rather than the words. This is debated and not widely accepted, and it is easy to overread patterns into lists. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a quiet game the scribes might have enjoyed, or a mnemonic trick, or a way to teach hierarchy subtly. You wander to a courtyard where people are washing hands at a basin before entering a small shrine. The basin water reflects torchlight. The washing is slow and methodical. The act is both practical and symbolic. Clean hands are useful. Clean hands also signal readiness. You watch a child imitate the adults, splashing too much, grinning. The adult gently corrects the child, and the child tries again, more carefully. A small joke floats in. Humanity's first training program is wash your hands properly, and humanity is still, to this day, not fully certified. You pass by a doorway where a priest is counting small tokens, perhaps used to track offerings or access. The tokens click softly. Token systems are ancient. Counting systems are ancient. The evidence we do have points to administrative tools evolving alongside writing. So the city feels like a network of checks and balances, not democratic in a modern sense, but procedural, controlled. And that procedural world makes departure protocol feel like the natural language of transition. Historians still argue whether the most secretive ritual procedures were designed mainly for spiritual purity, for political control, or for maintaining specialized knowledge within priestly families. You let that sentence drift like smoke. It is okay not to know. It is okay for the past to keep some doors closed. Now you step out through another gate and feel the night air again, cooler, softer. Insects sing. A distant drum beats slowly, like a heart in sleep mode. The city behind you is a maze of thresholds, each with its own rules, and you carry a calm conclusion. A protocol is often about crossing boundaries safely. In a world where names are keys and seals are signatures, departure can mean a controlled change in access and status. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we let the gates of the city become the gates of your mind, closing softly as you drift. You step into a cooler street where the lamps burn lower and the voices drop to whispers. The city feels different here, as if people are careful with their breath. The air smells like damp earth and soot, and a faint chill brushes your arms even though the night is not truly cold. You notice small offerings tucked into cracks in walls, bits of bread, a pinch of grain, a few beads, left like quiet messages for someone who does not answer out loud. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians imagined an underworld, often described as a bleak, regulated place, and that beliefs about death were woven into rituals, prayers, and myths. The evidence we do have points to underworld themes appearing in texts and to funerary and commemorative practices that kept relationships with the dead active. This is the solid ground. The underworld is not a modern invention. It is part of their mental map. You follow a narrow alley and reach a small courtyard where a family is gathered. They are not celebrating. They are not wailing. They are doing something quieter and more persistent. An older woman places a bowl of food near a low niche. A man pours a little water into the earth. A child watches, wide-eyed, learning the shape of a custom. The act is simple, but it feels heavy, like a stone warmed by many hands. One interpretation is that rituals for the dead, and for underworld beings, are not only about fear, they are about continuity. They are about keeping the living connected to the invisible parts of the community. A more cautious explanation could be that practices varied by class, time, and city, but the impulse is consistent. People do not like the idea of severed ties. They prefer rituals that keep the line unbroken. Now the departure protocol theme takes a new direction that keeps the listener from getting bored. Instead of gods leaving a city, you consider gods withdrawing into a different realm. In myth, movement between realms is common. A deity descends, a deity returns, a power shifts location. And if the underworld is imagined as a place with rules, gates, and officials, then movement into it could be described with procedures. A protocol fits naturally into a realm defined by regulations. You walk toward a small shrine at the edge of the neighborhood. The shrine is dim. A priest sits inside, speaking softly, his voice low and steady. The priest's hands move with practiced care, arranging a small set of objects: a lamp, a bowl, a handful of grain, a strip of cloth. The lamp's flame trembles, making shadows that dance gently across the walls. Not frightening, just alive. Most historians agree that ritual specialists performed incantations and prayers, and that protective rites were part of daily life in Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to a rich tradition of ritual texts and spoken formulas designed to maintain health, order, and spiritual balance. This is the mainstream anchor. People used words and rituals to manage uncertainty. Now you notice a tablet near the priest, and it is not a list of barley. It is a sequence of lines written carefully, like a script. The priest reads a line, then pauses, then repeats it with a slight variation. The repetition feels like stepping stones. One interpretation is that incantations often rely on structured repetition to build a sense of authority and rhythm. That rhythm is soothing. it can also feel like a set of instructions, because each line prompts the next. Historians still argue whether underworld-themed rituals were primarily about comforting the living, protecting the household from restless forces, or reinforcing social order by defining clear boundaries between the realms. You let that debate sit quietly. The priest continues reading. You cannot understand the exact words, but you feel their cadence. The cadence is the point tonight. A protocol is often a cadence. Step, breath, step, breath. Now the mist enters with careful framing. A popular rumor claims that some underworld texts are actually coded narratives of political exile or social disappearance, where going to the underworld is a metaphor for being removed from power. This theory isn't widely accepted as a universal explanation, but it is an interesting interpretive lens if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It suggests that departure language could sometimes be political language wearing mythic clothing. You step away from the shrine and walk along a street that leads to a small gate in a wall. The gate is not the city gate. It is a symbolic gate, an arch with carved markings, perhaps used in a ritual context. A priest approaches it, touches the lintel lightly, then steps through. The action is deliberate. You sense that this is a boundary crossing enacted in miniature, a way of practicing the idea of transition between realms. Archaeology suggests that boundaries and thresholds held ritual significance, and the evidence we do have supports the importance of controlled transitions in religious practice. So you watch the priest and realize a new development. A departure protocol might not be about leaving the world entirely. It might be about managing transitions of presence. A deity's presence can be invited, housed, or withdrawn through ritual. A spirit can be honored, soothed, or kept at a respectful distance. These are not mechanical claims. They are cultural practices that shape how people experience the unseen. One interpretation is that the underworld is imagined as bureaucratic because the human world is bureaucratic. If you live in a city where everything has a seal, a list, and an assigned role, you might imagine the afterlife similarly. Gates, guardians, rules, a place where you do not wander freely. You check in, you wait, you follow procedures. It is a little funny in a sad way. Humans cannot even imagine eternity without paperwork, and there is your sleepy joke. Imagine arriving at the underworld and being handed a clay tablet that says, "Please take a number." You would look around and realize the line is thousands of years long. Suddenly, mortality seems mercifully short. You continue walking and find a quiet garden area with a small tree, its leaves barely moving in the night breeze. Someone has hung little tokens from its branches, tiny clay shapes and bits of string. The tokens clink softly. It is not loud. It is delicate, like wind chimes made by people who are trying not to wake the dead. Most historians agree that offerings and commemorations for the dead are part of many ancient societies, and Mesopotamia is no exception. The evidence we do have includes references to providing food and water for ancestors, suggesting an ongoing relationship. This is documented territory, steady ground. Now you allow a cinematic what if, clearly imagined. What if a tablet exists that outlines the correct way to withdraw a deity's presence from a shrine temporarily, perhaps during a renovation, perhaps during a crisis, perhaps during a purification? The steps might resemble underworld imagery because withdrawal is like descent. Close the doors, cover the statue, speak the farewell lines. Offer water, seal the chamber, record the date. The language could sound like a departure protocol, but in practice it could be about controlled absence, not permanent leaving. A fringe idea proposes that underworld narratives preserve faint memories of real subterranean spaces, like storage pits, tombs, or hidden chambers used during unrest, and that the descent language hints at physical movement underground. This is debated and not widely accepted as direct evidence, but it can be treated as a possibility. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it gives the underworld stories a tangible edge. People may have entered real dark spaces and then told stories that amplified the feeling into mythology. You walk toward a low mound at the edge of the neighborhood. It could be a burial area or simply raised ground. The air is cooler here. The city sounds are distant. You hear a soft rustle, maybe a lizard in dry leaves, maybe a cat moving silently, maybe the night itself shifting position. A priest appears carrying a small lamp, walking slowly. He stops and places the lamp near the ground. He speaks softly, then pours water. The water darkens the soil. The act feels like feeding the earth. You stand at a respectful distance and watch, feeling the weight of human care. Even when people cannot change the fact of death, they can perform love in ritual form. One interpretation is that this kind of ritual is a protocol for relationship maintenance across boundaries. The dead are departed, but the living keep a channel open through offerings and remembrance. In that sense, a departure protocol is not only about God's leaving. It is about what humans do when someone is gone, the steps they follow to keep grief from becoming chaos. Historians still argue whether the underworld in Mesopotamian imagination is best understood as a literal destination in their belief system, a symbolic narrative space for exploring loss and power, or a blended concept shaped by both ritual practice and poetic storytelling. You let that sentence drift into the night. Now you take a slow breath and notice how calm your body feels in this quieter zone. The lamplight is gentle, the air is still, the ground is steady. The priest finishes the rite, stands, and walks away without drama, because rituals often end quietly, like sleep. There is no applause, there is only completion. You walk back toward the living streets and hear the city again, faint and soft. People speak in low voices. A baby fusses, then settles. A door closes. Somewhere, a bowl clinks. Ordinary life continues alongside invisible beliefs, and you carry a calm conclusion that is new, not a repeat. A departure protocol can be understood as the set of steps that manage absence, whether it is the absence of a person, a spirit, or a sense of protection. Underworld imagery provides a language of gates, rules, and controlled transitions that naturally fits procedural thinking. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we let the night stay quiet, like a lamp sheltered from wind. You step into a room that feels like the inside of a sealed jar, cool and still, with air that carries a faint, chalky smell. It is an archive room, the kind people do not visit for fun, unless they are the rare type of person who gets excited by shelves. You are that rare type tonight, because sleep loves quiet rooms with organized objects. Lamps sit in niches along the wall, their flames small and steady. The light falls across stacks of tablets like moonlight on stones. The evidence we do have points to ancient archives existing in Mesopotamia, with tablets stored in temples, palaces, and private houses. And archaeology suggests many collections were accidental time capsules, preserved by collapse, fire, or abandonment. Most historians agree that the survival of tablets is uneven and often depends on chance, which means what we read today is not the whole library, but a scattered sample. You walk along the shelves and notice something immediately. Damage, cracks, missing corners, tablets broken in half and rejoined by modern hands in your imagination. Some are smoothed, as if rubbed by time. Some are stained. Some are clean and sharp. This is a new development for the listener. Instead of imagining tablets as perfect messages, you see them as vulnerable objects that lived a rough life. A careful reading might suggest that the idea of a departure protocol sometimes grows larger in modern storytelling because of gaps. When a tablet is broken, the missing lines become a blank space people want to fill. The mind hates blanks. The mind sees a missing corner and thinks, that is where the secret was. Sometimes the missing corner is just where someone dropped it. You kneel near a low table where a scholar type is working, not modern, but an ancient scribe doing something surprisingly similar to modern scholarship. He has several fragments laid out, turning them, comparing them, trying to match edges. He presses two pieces together, then shakes his head and tries another pair. The act is quiet, patient, and honestly, a little adorable. He's doing a puzzle without knowing it will one day be called a puzzle. Most historians agree that scribes copied texts, and that copying introduces variation, mistakes, and sometimes intentional changes. The evidence we do have includes multiple versions of similar compositions across different sites and periods. That matters for how you interpret any dramatic phrase. A single line might appear in one copy and not another. A word might be spelled differently. A sign might be misread. So when someone claims a tablet reveals a protocol. One interpretation is that we should hold that excitement gently, because the text might be fragmentary, ambiguous, or context-dependent. Historians still argue whether differences between tablet versions reflect simple scribal error, regional tradition, purposeful editing for political or theological reasons, or changes in language over time. You let that sentence hang in the cool air. It is not discouraging. It is soothing. It means you do not have to cling to certainty. The past is allowed to be messy. The scholar-scribe lifts a fragment and points to a line. You look closely at the wedge marks. Some are deep. Some are faint. A faint mark might be a smudge. It might be a real sign. It might be a scratch from a careless fingernail. The difference between a smudge and a sign can change a translation. The difference between two similar signs can change a sentence. This is where the mystery lives, not in dramatic conspiracies, but in the practical difficulty of reading. One interpretation is that many modern hidden protocol claims arise from translation choices and the temptation to select the most exciting meaning of a word. Ancient words often have ranges of meaning. A term might mean go, depart, withdraw, set, remove, or cease, depending on context. The most dramatic option is not always the best option. A more cautious explanation could be that scholars look at context, parallel texts, and grammar to choose the most plausible meaning. But even then, uncertainty can remain. You notice on a shelf a set of tablets that are clearly school exercises. The wedges are repetitive, the lines neat, the content formulaic. Another set looks like legal contracts. Another set looks like hymns. Another set looks like a lament. This diversity is important. It keeps the story from narrowing into one dramatic idea. The archive is a city's mind, and the mind contains many genres. Now you find a basket of fragments, a pile of clay pieces that look like broken pottery, but are actually broken sentences. This is a new development for the listener. Instead of imagining a single tablet, you see how much of ancient writing survives in shards. A fragment might contain only 3 words. Those 3 words can become famous if they are poetic, but they can also be misleading if you do not know what surrounds them. A popular rumor claims that missing fragments are sometimes deliberately hidden because they would change the story of history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to grow when people underestimate how chaotic excavation and preservation can be. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded point remains. Missing pieces change what we can know, not because of a secret plot, but because clay breaks. You pick up a small fragment and turn it in your fingers. The edges are jagged. The surface has a few wedges. You cannot read it, but you can feel the temptation. The temptation to imagine it says something dramatic. The temptation to imagine it contains the last line of a divine farewell. The temptation is human, and tonight you can acknowledge it without giving it control. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Now you watch the scholar scribe do something even more interesting. He makes a copy. He presses a reed into wet clay and copies the signs from a damaged tablet, trying to preserve the content. This is how texts survive, even when originals degrade. Most historians agree that copying is a major reason we have literary compositions at all. The evidence we do have includes copies of older works made centuries later. That introduces a new, fresh complication. If a departure protocol appears in a later copy, is it original? Is it an addition? Is it a scribal flourish? Is it a regional variant? Scholars continue to debate these questions. You sit quietly and listen to the sound of stylus on clay. It is the softest scratching, almost like a pencil, but thicker, deeper. The sound becomes a lullaby. You could fall asleep to it easily, assuming you are not the scribe, because then you have deadlines. Here is a small joke to keep you floating. Imagine being an apprentice tasked with copying a sacred hymn, and you accidentally write, "May the God bless the bread," instead of, "May the God bless the land." Congratulations! You have invented the world's first bakery cult. Very wholesome, honestly. Now you move to another table, where a different worker is sorting tablets by shape and size. Some are small, like receipts. Some are larger, like letters. Some are thick, like official records. The worker taps each tablet, listening to the sound, perhaps checking if it is fully baked, perhaps checking for cracks. The sound is dull and comforting, like tapping a loaf. One interpretation is that when people speak of tablets revealing secrets, they forget that tablets are also administrative trash. Many tablets were temporary records. Some were never meant to last. Some were notes. Some were practice. The survival of any tablet is partly accidental. So the fact that a text survives does not automatically mean it was the most important text. It might just mean it was in the wrong place during the right disaster. A more cautious explanation could be that archives include both important and ordinary texts, and that context matters. Still, this perspective helps keep your mind calm and honest. It prevents you from turning every fragment into a prophecy. Now you find a tablet with a formal closing line, a kind of scribal signature. It names the scribe, perhaps the location, perhaps the purpose. This is a new development. It shows that some tablets carry metadata, the ancient equivalent of created by and last edited. That matters for interpreting anything protocol-like. If a tablet says it is for a ritual specialist, then it may truly be a procedure text. If it says it is a copy from a school, it may be an exercise. Knowing the function changes the meaning. Historians still argue whether certain ritual and literary tablets were used actively in ceremonies, memorized and performed from memory, or preserved mainly as educational and cultural reference texts. You let that debate float. You do not need to decide. The archive room is quiet enough to hold many possibilities at once. Now you allow a cinematic what if, clearly imagined. What if a broken tablet contains a sequence of steps, but the steps are incomplete? The first lines survive. The last lines are missing. The surviving portion reads like the beginning of a farewell, formal and careful. The missing portion might have been mundane, like return the objects to storage, or it might have been poetic, like the city will wait, you cannot know, and that not knowing becomes part of the story. A departure protocol might be less a discovered manual, and more a modern name for the feeling you get when you see a procedural text cut off mid-thought. A fringe idea proposes that deliberate fragmentation, whether from political upheaval or ritual destruction, could have been used to neutralize the power of certain texts. This is debated and not widely accepted as a general rule. But it is possible in isolated cases that objects were broken intentionally. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it adds a quiet edge. A broken tablet might not only be an accident, it might sometimes be an act of fear or control. Still, evidence would vary, and you do not need to lean on this to enjoy the mystery. You stand and take in the archive again. Rows of clay, rows of human effort, names, numbers, hymns, prayers, contracts, laments. The past does not speak in one voice. It murmurs in many tones, and you are listening gently. You walk toward the exit, and as you do, you notice one last shelf with tablets wrapped in cloth. The cloth is worn, and the knots are neat. Someone cared enough to protect these. That care is another clue. It suggests importance. But importance can mean many things. It can mean sacred. It can mean legal. It can mean sentimental. It can mean a favorite text used for teaching. The mind wants to label it, but the archive resists. You breathe in the cool air one more time and let the archive's quiet settle into you. The new understanding you carry is simple and calming. The shape of what we know from tablets is shaped by survival, damage, copying, and interpretation. A departure protocol might be a real procedural text, or it might be a modern framing of fragmentary ritual instructions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we let the missing corners stay missing, like a soft blur at the edge of sleep. You walk out beyond the city walls into open land where the night feels wider, quieter, and less complicated. The ground is soft in places, firm in others, and the air smells like dry grass, cooling mud, and distant water. In the sky, stars hold their positions with that calm confidence you wish you had when you misplace your keys. A faint breeze moves through the reeds along a low marsh, making a whispering sound that feels like someone turning pages very slowly. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer's influence does not vanish when a city changes hands or a dynasty ends. The evidence we do have points to ideas, stories, and administrative habits traveling forward into later Mesopotamian cultures, reshaped but recognizable. Writing traditions persist. Temple practices evolve. Myths are copied, edited, and reinterpreted. So if you're looking for a clean moment where the gods left, the solid ground suggests something different. What continues is often more important than what ends. You stand near a small campfire, not a roaring blaze, just a gentle flame that warms your hands and makes the night feel friendly. Beside it lies a small pile of objects, ordinary and symbolic at once. A reed bundle, a clay token, a simple cord, a smooth stone. You pick up the reed bundle and roll it between your fingers. Reeds are fragile, but they keep returning. They become styluses, they become baskets, they become mats, they become the quiet backbone of daily life. That is a kind of legacy. One interpretation is that the phrase departure protocol, when applied to ancient tablets, may be less about a literal exit and more about continuity. A careful reading might suggest the protocol is really a set of procedures that outlast any single ruler, priest, or even any single version of a story. Institutions survive by writing down what to do when the familiar changes. The protocol is not the moment of leaving. The protocol is the plan for what remains. Historians still argue whether the most dramatic language of divine withdrawal in Mesopotamian literature should be read as theological metaphor for political collapse, a ritual drama that helps communities recover from crisis, or a reflection of genuine belief that divine presence could move between cities and temples. You let that sentence float upward like a spark from the fire. It rises, dims, and disappears, and you feel no urge to chase it. Debate can exist without disturbing your calm. Now the night offers a new development that ties everything together without repeating it. You imagine a temple official, not a king, not a mythic hero, just an administrator with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. He is sitting in a quiet room with a stack of tablets, organizing them by purpose: offerings, calendar, purification, inventory, oaths, emergency steps. He's not thinking in headlines, he's thinking in categories. In that mindset, departure protocol becomes a label you might put on a bundle of texts that deal with absence, transition, and handover. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And evidence for a single labeled departure protocol bundle is not something you can treat as universally documented across all contexts. But the evidence we do have points to the existence of procedures, standard formulas, and institutional continuity. That might support the idea that certain texts functioned like manuals for transition, whether the transition was a festival ending, a statue moving, a priest changing roles, or a city handling disaster. A popular rumor claims that the gods left behind a direct set of final instructions, like a farewell letter to humanity written in clay, and that those who understand the true meaning can decode it. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on selecting the most dramatic reading of ambiguous lines. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting thing is what it reveals about us. We want the past to be a message addressed to us personally. We want closure. We want a final page where the author says, "Here is exactly what happened, and here is exactly what to do." But ancient texts do not always offer that kind of closure. They offer fragments. They offer lists. They offer hymns. They offer administrative notes. They offer myths that behave like mirrors, reflecting the concerns of the people who told them. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And that is okay. Unconfirmed does not mean useless. It means the past is still alive enough to invite interpretation. A fringe idea proposes that departure language encodes an actual shift in human history, a moment when advanced protectors withdrew and left humanity to manage alone. This is debated and not widely accepted, but it can be held gently as a cinematic mood rather than a conclusion. What if, in the torchlight of a temple, people genuinely felt that something had changed? Not because a spaceship took off, but because the world became harder, politics became sharper, floods became more dangerous, and the sense of protection felt thinner. That feeling could be written as divine departure, because myth is often how humans translate emotion into story. You look up at the stars again and let your eyes soften, the way you do when you're about to fall asleep. The stars are steady. They do not explain themselves. They do not offer footnotes. They simply exist, and people build meaning around them. That is a quiet truth that fits both history and mystery. The evidence we do have points to humans always doing this, always turning the sky, the river, the temple, and the archive into language. You poke the fire gently with a stick, and the flame flutters, then settles. You listen to the reeds whispering near the marsh. The sound is soft, repetitive, and calming. It reminds you of a stylus on clay, of counting days, of murmured prayers, of gatekeepers checking seals, not as a recap, but as a sensation, like a lullaby motif that returns without calling attention to itself. Now you allow one last cinematic what-if, clearly framed as imagination, and you keep it calm. What if there was, in some temple somewhere, a tablet used only at rare moments when a community felt the sacred presence was withdrawing? The tablet might have instructed them not to panic. It might have guided them through practical steps, securing supplies, repairing canals, organizing leadership. It might have guided them through ritual steps, purification, offerings, hymns, controlled silence. And then it might have ended with something simple, like Keep the records, teach the apprentices, maintain the calendar, repair what breaks. In that sense, the departure protocol would not be a goodbye from gods. It would be a reminder that humans must be caretakers of order, even when they feel alone. That is a possibility, not a certainty. You take a slow breath, and you feel how the night air fills your chest and leaves again. Your shoulders loosen. The fire dims a little, as if it is ready to rest too. The land around you is quiet, and the city behind you is only a faint glow. Now the wind down begins, and the pacing softens, and the vocabulary becomes gentler, like a blanket pulled up carefully to your chin. You let the idea of ancient clay settle into your mind as something steady and warm. Clay is humble. Clay is earth and water, shaped by hands, marked by a reed, and then left to dry. It is not flashy. It does not demand attention. It simply holds the shape you give it. That is what these stories do in their best and calmest form. They hold the shape of human effort. They hold the shape of people trying to organize their days, protect their families, honor their gods, and make sense of floods, rulers, and the wide silent sky. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You do not need to solve every puzzle tonight. You do not need to decode every fragment. You can let the unanswered questions remain soft at the edges, like shadows that do not threaten, only blur. In the distance, the reeds keep whispering, and the marsh water makes tiny sounds as it moves around roots and stones. The fire becomes a small glow, then smaller, then only a warm suggestion of light. You feel your eyelids heavy, your breathing slow, your thoughts less sharp, more dreamy. If there was ever a protocol worth keeping, it is this simple one. Breathe in, breathe out, let the day depart, let the night arrive. Let your mind close its gates gently, one by one, without effort, without worry. And as the stars hold steady overhead, you drift into a quiet place where history is not a test, but a lullaby, and mystery is not a threat, but a soft fog that makes the lamplight kinder. End of script. Sweet dreams.